Okay, good evening, good afternoon, everybody. This is Lynn O'Hara at NHD, and I am so thrilled to be here tonight with Kate Kennedy and Christopher Hamner so we can talk about the experiences of service members and researching the military experience. First off, I want to give a quick shout out to Liz DeLucia and the team from the ABMC. I also got to hang out with Liz a little bit on Friday at NCSS, and we had some great discussions. And we have some cool ideas that we're working on, seeing if we can get to happen for 2026 or 27 or 28. So stay tuned. There might be some exciting things coming. All right, couple quick things for housekeeping, and then we're going to get rolling pretty quickly. You know how this works. Google Classroom just sent you an email that says you're late. You're not, you're here. It's cool. We're good. You've got Q&A box. We've also got live captioning enabled, which I should enable. You can always turn it off if it's distracting to you. At the end, do your survey to get your attendance credit. Your slides and the video will be posted tomorrow to Google Classroom, just like we do. That's what Kate and I start off with in the morning, so it'll be there. Really just takes as long as the video takes to process. What we're going to be working on between now and January 9th of 2026, it's actually here, is our military experience organizers. And I know I've gotten some questions, hey, do we have military files yet? We're going to talk about that tonight. Some of you do. And I'm just going to do a quick shout out here. Beth Doty, I just dropped an almost 300-page file into your folder. So I haven't gotten the emails out yet, but I got 5 in at the end of the day and just got those up. So now you're not going to pay attention to the whole webinar because you're going to go look, but that's okay. We have it on video. But our goal is to work on the military piece from now until the 9th of January, where the next module will launch. All right, that's my business. Go ahead and turn things over to Christopher. He's going to talk a little bit about the question about what was the experience like for your service members in each of the wars. And then I'm going to talk about how do we figure out what they did. So, Christopher, it's all
And
you.
thank you so much and welcome everybody. We're really delighted that you took some time out of a busier than usual week, I'm sure, here in December to spend a little time talking about research and the experience of American soldiers at war in the 20th century. This is one of the webinars that I am usually really excited about because this is a part of the experience that has kind of organized all of the research that I've done as a professional historian going back to graduate school. I've always been drawn to these individual stories about what going to war requires of people and what it does to people. And with this project, we are looking at almost the totality of American soldiers' experience in the 20th century. And I'm really excited to share some of the frameworks that I've learned about that will hopefully help you organize your thinking about your research. And then Lynn is going to come in with some really nuts and bolts tips and ideas about organizing things. So my central focus in telling the stories about individual soldiers is about motivation, like what makes them do the things that they have to do. And I will give a spoiler right now here at the top of the webinar. There is no one size fits all answer to this big question. And this project really throws the variety of American experiences at war into sharp relief because we're working in 4 different conflicts, different people, different community contexts, different kinds of wars, different moments in the century. Like there is a ton of variety here, and I'm not going to pretend to give a one size fits all answer to this question. What I am going to do is share with you a 3-part model or framework that might help you think about the research you're doing, and then give you a way to kind of organize your brainstorming. And we'll talk about a few of the commonalities that all of your research subjects have. And then I'll hand things off to Lynn, who will talk about how to take this and put it into practice. So one of the things that I'm really drawn to and always cognizant of about this this set of soldiers, that is Americans going off to war in the 20th century, is that by and large they start before the wars as civilians. Overwhelmingly, they are people who are not professional soldiers. They have not been training their entire lives to go off and fight. Most of you are probably researching someone who was living a civilian life and then was plucked out of it by circumstance. And that's one really important thing to keep in mind, as is the fact that they go through a sort of transition, a process that is designed to take raw civilians and turn them into people who know what to do in war theaters and who are ready to be part of the military organization and the military hierarchy. So whether you're looking at the First World War here in the upper left-hand corner or the Second World War in the lower right, you might be doing research on Korea or Vietnam. Each of them is passing through this kind of threshold, going from a relatively peaceful civilian life to a very different kind of life in the military. And that's one thing that I think is useful to keep in mind. The other thing that has kept me coming back to this research for a quarter of a century is just how compelling I think this question is, that we are taking regular civilians and through some set of processes, preparing them to withstand some incredibly dramatic and often very traumatic circumstances and expecting them to perform. I was an English major in college. I came into history through the side door, but I was really drawn to stories of people in extraordinary circumstances. And I wanted to know more about this question, which to me is just kind of a fundamental question of human behavior. Why do people do the things that we see them doing in extreme circumstances? And for American soldiers of the 20th century as a group are arguably the best studied and most carefully researched group of soldiers in human history. The US military has a tremendous interest in trying to understand what their experiences are like. They have a very urgent need to try to make sure that they are putting people into combat situations who can perform and who can do the things that they need, that the system needs done, that the country needs done. And so, if you are interested in these behavioral questions, American soldiers in the 20th century are a great place to look because we just have so much data and evidence. In the Second World War, the US military will mobilize like a battalion of academics, people with PhDs in history, in political science, in sociology, in psychology, and they will send them out and they will give them questions of behavior. Why do they do this? What is the thing that keeps them going? How can we better prepare them? This photograph is of one of those researchers, a guy named S.L.A. Marshall, and you see him out in the Pacific, and he is interviewing soldiers who have just come out of a firefight. Marshall believed that in order to really get a kind of unfiltered, undistorted sense of what soldiers' experience in battle was like, you had to talk to them as close to the experience as possible. If you waited a week or a month or 6 months, their memory was going to start filtering and distorting some of their experiences. And so he has a whole uh, set of research that is built on these firsthand interviews that are done as close to the moment of combat as he could. All of this research and all of these surveys and all of these interviews and all of this empirical data from the 20th century, I think boils down to a framing that two psychiatrists who were brought on by the United States Army Air Forces in World War II boiled down to this one question. What possesses a rational man to make him act irrationally? And this to me is what the sort of crux of the question of motivation. Our instinct for self-preservation is so incredibly powerful. It is one of, if not the most powerful, biologically ingrained drives that we have. And participating in war, going off into battle, or going into harm's way requires a person to tamp down that overwhelming instinct for self-preservation long enough to do some dangerous, life-threatening things, often in very extreme circumstances. And these two psychiatrists, Roy Grinker and Don Spiegel, said going into battle is an irrational act. And what is it that allows rational people to do this thing that's irrational? So that's the question that's been kind of organizing my research. And one of the frameworks that has been really helpful to me in kind of digging down deep into a particular person or a particular battle or a particular community is the three-part model of soldier motivation. This was originally devised by a historian of the French Revolution. So this is not my original work, but it's one of two things I want to share with you tonight as just a way to think about what you're learning about the subject of your research. This French historian's name is John Lynn, suggested that we really want to think about soldier motivation in three phases or three parts. So that there's initial motivation, which is the thing that gets you to leave your civilian life behind and join the military in the first place. There's sustaining motivation, which is the factors that keep you together with the army while you're out on campaign, while you're deployed in between battles when life is usually pretty miserable. And then the last part, combat motivation. What is it that is driving soldiers once the firing starts? And so I think what essentially Lynn's framework suggests is that this question is probably just the wrong question to ask. That a better way to approach this big, messy, compelling, intriguing question of human behavior is to break it into moments and to think about motivation as occurring in phases. So, why do you join the army in the first place? Why do you stay with the army? How do you face the trauma and the terror and the confusion of battle? And that's a way to kind of dig into individual research and think about what is happening in each of these moments for the subject of your research. The other thing I might add that we'll cover just before I hand things over to Lynn is what happens when you repeatedly send someone into these kinds of circumstances? What happens when you try to reactivate combat motivation over and over again? And one of the things that the experience of American soldiers in the 20th century starts to suggest is that every person has a limit. You cannot continue to ask people to go into these situations indefinitely, and that there is a breaking point. And the breaking point gets different names. It's called one thing in the Great War and something different in World War II, and the nomenclature changes, but a lot of the symptoms seem pretty much the same. The two photographs, the one that's on the screen and the one that I just showed, are both taken from the Second World War. But if you were to crop out the uniform and the helmet, which kind of give away the date, and just look at the face, those photographs look like they could have been taken this morning. There's a famous photograph from the Iraq War that became known as Fallujah Man, who has a different helmet and a different uniform, but that same look. And I think that look is maybe revealing something about what happens when you put people in this situation over and over again. So I said I was going to give you two things. The first thing is the three-part model and this idea of thinking about the things that are pushing your research subject into war in three different moments. The other thing that's been super useful in organizing my thinking and organizing my students' thinking when we're in class is thinking about carrots and sticks. We're thinking, put differently, things that pull you into a situation versus things that push you into a situation, or incentives and coercion. What are the things that are being offered that you want that get you to do something, and what are the punishments that are being threatened that might drive you in? And so we've got to kind of push and pull. And in my experience, just about everywhere I've looked, in every phase of the experience, you see a blend of carrots and sticks. But when I'm doing some new research, I often pause and think, what are the things that are pulling this person in, and what are the things that might be pushing this person in? So let's start with the first phase. Let's think about initial motivation. And again, there's no one size fits all uh, answer for the millions of Americans who go to war in the 20th century, but there's some broad ways to think about their experience. And you could start with the carrots. Like, what are the things that are pulling people into the military system and encouraging them to leave the comfort of home? And we've already talked about the sort of ideological components of these conflicts. People are being told what's at stake for the nation, what's at stake for the way of life. And many, many people respond to that. Like, I want to serve, I want to support the nation and the idea of democracy. And that's a really powerful carrot. And there are other kinds of carrots that are maybe a little more concrete or a little more immediate. You know, uh, you'll be a more appealing romantic partner. You know, you can be more of a man if you join the military, or you're going to be paid better than what you would be paid in a civilian job, or you'll receive some sort of tangible benefit. And those are carrots too. And in a lot of different cases in the 20th century, you'll see both the kind of high-minded ideology acting as a carrot and some of the more kind of immediate visceral things. There's sticks too in initial motivation. And one of the things that I think everybody can look for in their own research, I mean, the most powerful coercive element that the government has is the draft, conscription. You know, people are being pulled in sometimes for some reasons, and then in other cases, they're being forced in. They're being required to join the military. And so we've got, you know, different ways of generating people, generating armies, and pulling people out of their civilian lives. But you can think about that as you're making your way through the story of your research subject. The second part of the three-part model is the sustaining motivation. Once you're in the military, life is usually a lot less glamorous and considerably more miserable than people had imagined before they go in. And the story of being in a combat theater or, you know, at war, even when you are not directly involved in combat on a particular day, is usually one of deprivation and physical discomfort or physical misery. The weather is terrible, whether it's too hot or too cold. Everything is wet all of the time. The military system is one that a lot of Americans find profoundly obnoxious, whether they're going off to war in 1918 or 1944 or 2014. Americans don't like taking orders. They don't like the idea that someone else has a position of authority over them. Like, the whole system is just not that much fun. And complaining is one of the great themes in all of the American soldiers' experiences that I've read in the last quarter century. American soldiers are famous for griping and for griping in colorful and often hilarious and entertaining ways. So one of the things that comes up a lot is the quality of the food, the quality of the misery of the weather is the other one. American soldiers in the 20th century are the I think the best fed army of the 20th century. And yet soldiers complain about the monotony of the food or the taste or the consistency. I mean, this is stuff that they complain about and they write about endlessly. Like, just being a soldier is miserable, even when you're not being shot at. So why do they do it? Here too, I think of carrots and sticks. I mean, there are things that are pulling you in. If you joined the army uh, in pursuit of some sort of ideological aim, then you might very logically stay with the army in pursuit of that, right? I signed on to fight Nazis and now I'm off doing that, and it's not as much fun as I imagined it would be, but it is still an important thing. There's a lot of stuff that is kind of pulling people together. And then remember too that all of your subjects have gone through this process of transformation. They have gone from civilian lives into the military. And that involves not just teaching them what they need to know and to do in combat. So, you know, how to aim the weapon, how to clean the weapon, how to scale a 6-foot wall. But it also involves a sort of psychological or sociological transformation where you take independent civilians and bring them into a system that does not really prize independence and prizes obedience and kind of top-down hierarchy. And that's a really important part of the transition in the 20th century, going from civilian through basic training. A lot of these things are sort of symbolic. So the really famous haircuts that most American soldiers will get, you know, starting in World War II and after. You're forcibly kind of deprived of your civilian hairstyle, and someone else tells you the haircut, and it's cut so short that you can't do anything with it. And partly that's there are some reasons to do that in terms of hygiene, but also it's about showing that you are now part of a system and you do not have the same choices and the same identity that you used to have as a civilian. This is a soldier who's going off to Vietnam in 1964, who's, I think, kind of mugging it up for the camera. But if you see footage of people being in processed, the idea of having your long hair cut off and having to wear the buzz cut is really unpleasant. It reminds these people who've been brought into the system that they are not allowed to just make up their own minds anymore. You are part of a coercive system in which you have to obey orders by force of law. And so one other really powerful sustaining motivator for these American soldiers is that you cannot leave, or if you leave and are caught, you have committed what is, at least on the books, a capital offense. The United States Army does not execute very many of its own soldiers for desertion. Other armies are freer with applying that punishment. But in World War II, the United States executes only one of its own soldiers. It's this guy here, a guy named Eddie Slovik, who had deserted multiple times in the ETO and been caught. The case gets to Eisenhower's desk, who says we have to enforce the punishment in this case because there are lots of other American soldiers that might be thinking about running away, and we need to make sure that we enforce the punishment as a deterrent. So there's the carrot of fighting for the country, doing your part as an American, proving your manhood, but then there's also the really powerful stick, the coercion of you cannot leave. You face very serious punishment if you're caught. The last piece is to me the most fascinating and also the most difficult to study. What makes people act when the bullets are flying and when you're confronted with sensory overload and confusion and mortal danger. And it turns out that this is, I think, the most fascinating piece, but also the hardest to look at because we don't have the sources that we would like to have. Many of the people that we want to hear from don't survive their time in combat. And many of the people who do find it difficult to talk about afterwards. And so it is more challenging to study this piece than the first two. And yet there's so much that, I don't know, just the human story. I want to know more about that experience. And obviously the experience is really different depending on whether you are in the Great War or World War II, the Korean conflict or Vietnam. The technology is changing dramatically over the course of 100 years. So I'm not going to give you a one size fits all explanation because there isn't one, but I'll point out a couple of things. One of them is that the 20th century looks a lot different than the preceding 4,000 years in terms of the way people fight. So if you've ever seen images of the American Civil War or the American War of Independence with redcoats marching out in the open, or you've ever seen like an image of a Greek phalanx where the soldiers are all standing packed into tight lines, and you've wondered, why on earth would they do that? That just seems suicidally futile, packing people into tight lines and marching out in the open. One of the reasons those technologies work so well is because it's much easier to use the stick when everybody is packed into a place and they can be observed by their officers and by their non-commissioned officers. In the 20th century, we've got these new technologies that are going to be visible in all of the conflicts that we're studying in this program, particularly automatic weapons and high explosive artillery, which puts a tremendous amount of metal in the air. So World War I German stormtrooper called this the storm of steel. And one of the things about increasing the amount of metallic shrapnel in the air exponentially, so like 2 orders of magnitude, is that soldiers have to spread out, they have to wear camouflage, they have to try to hide their movements, and you get the kind of pictures that are probably familiar to most of you from movies, if there's a gamer in your household, from the research that you're doing, like these empty battlefields where the soldiers are not advertising their whereabouts and they're not marching in elbow to elbow and shoulder to shoulder. And that's very effective at reducing exposure, but the sticks don't work as well because you can't monitor soldiers' behavior. And so in the 20th century, American armies have to come up with more carrots, more things that pull people into battle when they can't directly force them to go in. And that's one of the reasons that there is this massive mobilization of scholars and researchers to go out and study these guys. This actually starts before World War II. This study is called Fear in Battle. It's by a Yale psychologist, and he studied Americans who had gone off against State Department rules to fight in the Spanish Civil War. And then he came back and he asked them survey questions and follow-up questions about what made them afraid. It seems kind of simple, almost almost faintly ridiculously so, but it's the first kind of scientific attempt to diagram and kind of prioritize the things that soldiers are afraid of when they go into combat. And one of the things that happens as a result, starting in the Second World War and going into the 21st century, is what's called realistic training, giving soldiers a taste of the actual things they're going to have to do, and often doing that in the context of what are called live fire exercises. So people are shooting over your head so that you can get a little taste of what that feels like, and particularly what your body does in response to it. Quickened heartbeat, dry mouth, sweaty palms. Those were things that this John Dollard, the author of Fear in Battle, his soldiers had identified those things as being really deleterious to going into combat because all of the adrenaline and the neurochemicals that were flooding your system. And they said it was really especially hard the first time you went into battle. The training, starting in the 1940s, is often referred to as battle inoculation. Let's give people a little taste of what this experience will be like, and especially what their bodies experience of it will be like, that will help them manage it when they are actually overseas, when they are actually being shot at for real. The other thing that comes up every place I look is just a plethora of publications and pamphlets and films that the military generates to talk to their soldiers and say, here is what you're going to have to do. Here is what it's going to be like. Here is why we are asking you to do this. American soldiers have things explained to them in much more granular detail than most other soldiers. There's something I think in the American psyche that people are willing to do hard things in wartime, but they want to be told why. And so that's something that you see all over the kind of training process and getting people ready to go into combat, explanations of why we're doing this. The two other things that kind of come to the forefront in combat motivation, the importance of leadership, the people, officers and NCOs that the Army has put out to manage, guide, and drive the men sometimes. And if you're interested in digging deeper in your research subjects experience, reach out to me and I can point you to the kinds of things that people in those armies were being read and were reading and being told at that time. And you can get a little deeper window into what that world was like in that moment. The other thing is this idea of the tight emotional bonds that form among the members of the squad or the platoon. This is an idea that's called unit cohesion in among researchers. That's the sort of scientific name for it. It comes up a lot in popular history of men at war. It turns out it is much more controversial among researchers who are not at all convinced that it does what people think that it does. But nobody doubts that it exists, and these intense bonds that form among people who have been subject to these extraordinary experiences together, those are very real. Last thing I want to draw your attention to is something that I think is applicable to everybody uh, who fights in the armies of the 20th century. And so this is something that might illuminate some part of your soldier's experience, is a finding that the Army hits on uh, later in World War II. It's a result of all these researchers that they've sent into the field and that they've assigned these big questions of what makes soldiers fight. And one of the things that starts coming back from all different theaters and from all different branches and services is that there is a pretty dramatic drop off in combat performance, and that it seems to happen at roughly the same time for almost everyone. So somewhere around 250 days, soldiers, no matter where they are on the planet or what particular part of the military they find themselves in, about 250 days seems to be about the limit. And after that, combat effectiveness plunges. And this is not information that the US military really wants to discover. It is not great for managing a war effort to learn that there seems to be some human limit. My my guess at this point in my career is that that 250 days and the fact that it seems to hold across conflicts and across, the decades, has something to do with the way we're wired, and that there is only so much that the human nervous system can bear, and that it cannot necessarily be reset easily. One of my favorite authors and also a World War II veteran is this guy, Paul Fussell, who served in the American infantry, was very seriously wounded in 1944. And he came up with a sort of three-phase model of soldier awareness. He was around a lot of soldiers in World War II, and he said that in his experience, everybody went through three phases. He said that you get to basic training, you're 22 years old, and he said everybody in basic training is convinced that it cannot happen to them. I cannot be killed. I'm too special. I'm too popular. I'm too unique. I can't imagine a world without me. This can't happen to me. And Fussell said that's almost universal. But he said everybody, after a certain amount of exposure, either in training or certainly once you get, delivered into the theater, starts to realize it can happen. Uh, and that the first response is to say, I have to be a better soldier, more alert, better equipped, sharper. That is what will get me through. As long as I am the most effective soldier, that is the thing that will see me through this traumatic experience. And Fussell said that was the thing that people clung to for a long time. But if you were in combat long enough, he said everybody finally arrived at this last realization because you saw that combat doesn't single out, the cowardly or the lazy or the slow, that there are heroic people who die, um, that there are sloppy people who are spared, and that combat is just a big random lottery. And Fussell said everybody finally comes to this conclusion that is fatalistic. It is going to happen to me. Nothing I can do will prevent it. I think the red part of this graph here is that point where soldiers are clinging to the idea that if they are on the top of their game, they will somehow come through unscathed. The thing that comes, or one of the things that comes out of World War II as a result of this, is not signing up soldiers for the duration anymore. In World War II, soldiers go off, you are going to stay until the war is won. Korea experiments with 12-month rotations. By the time we get to Vietnam, we are sending soldiers over to Vietnam for just 12 months in the hopes that they will not burn out or be broken. They're almost like advent calendars. Soldiers are marking off the days until they get to go back. That has some useful, I think, some useful implications for the psychology of the soldiers. But if you believe that these tight emotional bonds between people who know each other and trust each other are really important, bringing people in and leaving them for a year and then pulling them back out is going to tend to pull those bonds apart. And we see what happens when people are pushed too far or asked to do too much, and the kinds of breakdown that they experience. They have different names. It's shell shock in the First World War. It's combat exhaustion or battle fatigue in the Second World War. By the time we get to Vietnam, it's post-traumatic stress. But a lot of the symptoms are similar. A lot of the presentations are similar. And the military has a real sense of this as early as 1945. There is a wonderful film that the Army makes called Let There Be Light that I cannot recommend enough if you're interested in soldiers coming back from any conflict. This is about the Second World War, but I think it has some sort of universal messages. If you're interested in soldiers coming back from conflict, or equally interesting, what the Army is trying to do to help them readjust. This is a fantastic, fantastic film that you can watch. The National Archives or on YouTube, and it's really, really interesting and gives a kind of window into what this does to people. That's my big three-part framework and sticks and carrots, which are hopefully useful for organizing some of your thinking. I'm going to hand things over to my partner, Lynn, who's going to talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts. And with that, she is back in the driver's seat,
All right.
and I
Thanks
will
so
stick around for
much.
questions.
Thanks so much, Christopher. All right, so what I want to do is take a second and pause. I think one of the things that we have to be careful with a project like this is that this is the kind of project where it's very easy to get lost in a tree and forget that you're in a forest. So I think we got to start by just stepping back for just a second. If we rise above, we look at our silent hero's life. The reality is, for most of the people you're studying, with a few exceptions, most of their lifespan is somewhere between 20 and 30 years. So it's a really short time period that we're focusing on. When we talk about their life before the war, that's the majority of their life. So that was our first module. Last module, we kind of took the bird's eye view and looked at the home front and the community. And what we're going to look at here is their military experience, which for the majority of them is really just a few months or a few years of their life. Um, I'm going to be honest, this is a time period that is very challenging to research, and there's a bit of a feast or a famine element. Sometimes you find a lot, sometimes you find a little. But there are going to be really good nuggets. And I think what I want to do is, just like we've done, start with one of our stories and one of our people. And I chose John Dooley Rucker, as far because he's a special place in my heart, but also because he served in both World War II and Korea, one of our few who kind of crossed different stories. So, a little story time here. You can put your pencil down for a second. Rucker is born in 1915. He graduates high school and he spends a year at the University of Missouri. At that point, he leaves college. We don't really know why. Excuse me. And at some point in the late 1930s, he moves to California and enlists in the Marine Corps. Again, no idea when, no idea why, but we know that on October 20th, 1940, he joins the Marines. So this is pre-Pearl Harbor. That following May, he set sail for Guam. So Guam's in the Mariana Islands, is the home to Haganta Harbor, which is a really key naval facility for the Pacific Theater. This is a very remote place. For those of you who have traveled there today, I know Christopher and I have, it's an 8-hour flight from Honolulu to Guam. And that's before you get anywhere else. And it's another like 3.5, 4 hours to Manila in the Philippines. So you've got a sense of distance. Now, this is a very remote place. And in the fall of 1941, there were only about 150 Marines to defend the island. Although, that being said, this is a pretty sweet assignment as far as being a Marine goes. You're far from home, but you're in a place with beautiful tropical beaches. I mean, there's certainly worse places to be assigned. On December 8th, 1941, Guam is attacked at the same time as the attack on Pearl Harbor, the attack on Midway, and the attack on the Philippines. It's the 8th because they're on the other side of the date line. And this attack is fierce and furious. In the attack, one of his fellow servicemen was injured, And Rucker actually puts him in a car and drives him 14 miles to the naval hospital while under bombardment. Later, some other officers try to recognize him for his courage, but it's decided that he did not receive the Silver or Bronze Star for his actions on that day. Guam is very quickly overrun, and from December 11th, 1941 to September 2nd, 1945, Rucker is a prisoner of war of the Empire of Japan. This is about as bad as it could possibly get. He survives hell ships. He survives time in Zensuji POW camp and Osaka main camp in Japan. He suffers through dysentery, beriberi, pellagra, and malnutrition. The fact that he survives is pretty gosh darn near a miracle. After the war, he's sick. He is put back on the USS Rescue, which is a hospital ship, returned to San Francisco, and he's discharged in February 1946. Now, for most Americans, that would have been the end of the story. But we don't know too much about what happened in between. But just over 2 years later, in April 1948, he re-enlists in the Marine Corps. And I think this is a really powerful, what would make someone do this? The Korean War heats up. He is involved in the Incheon landings. In the beginning, though, he's kind of bounced between different units. He ends up in an infantry unit. And on December 6, 1950, he's part of the 1st Marine Division, assigned to a light machine gun unit that's advancing from Hagaru-ri to Kotu-ri. And this happens. Not going to do the whole thing, but we know that on that day, moving towards his section of guns in sub-zero temperatures and under hostile fire, he calmly directed and supervised the gun emplacement, promptly put them into action, and personally made several trips to the ammunition supply point. Later that day, he is struck by a missile and mortally wounded. He does receive the Silver Star for his action. I might argue he should have had two, but we'll let that go for just a moment. Now, that's a story, right? That's a fascinating story. But I want to stop and ask you. So we're going to go to that Q&A box here. How would we learn about this military experience? What kind of sources might we look for? What might we find? Because honestly, putting this together is a trail of puzzle pieces. What might give us a piece of the puzzle that would help us tell his story? You're going to test my teacher wait time? I don't mind teacher wait time. I'm totally okay with it.
She's the queen.
I taught 7th
Okay.
graders. Please.
All right, we're coming in now. Military newspapers like Stars and Stripes.
Mhm.
Good one. Personal entries from others who were there, regardless of the side.
Mhm.
Letters and personal journals, military records, military citations and unit records, letters and journals.
Lots of different things. And here's the reality. For
Hospital
almost
records.
all of your people, because they passed away and because it was not exactly legal to be keeping journals at the time, we're not necessarily going to find their accounts. Sometimes we get little bits of it in letters, but for the most part, we don't know. But we do know a little bit about the people around them. Kate, anything else before I hop forward?
There's an interesting one, medical reports written by
Yes,
the
medical reports
doctors.
will come through. That's
Yes.
how we know about the dysentery and the beriberi. That's medical reports. Okay, so there's lots of different sources, and some of them we can easily get to, and some are a little harder. So, all right, if you're like me, I'm going to fess up to this, and you can't sleep, you watch House Hunters on HGTV. And if you ever watch that show, they look at 3 different houses and they have like these crazy expectations. Like, we're going to have 5 bedrooms and a pool and 3 living rooms, and I want the cost to be $150,000, right? And they do those little check sheets. You're not going to get everything. So let's talk about some of these common sources and some of the challenges we run into. So some of the things that we can find as we kind of map these out and look at the 4 different conflicts. The first is an official military personnel file. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's a personnel file. Now, in World War I, World War II, in Korea, If you're studying someone in the Army or the Army Air Forces, it's very unlikely we're going to get that file. And when we do, it's really exciting. The Marine Corps, Navy, Coast Guard, much more likely. Now, we don't have these files for Vietnam. They do exist, but we can't get to them because of privacy rules. However, we have filed something called a Freedom of Information Act, and I sent about 5 or 6 of these yesterday to some of you studying Vietnam, which is a partial file. It's snippets from the file, but it gives some really good clues. The second type of file is the file that covers you after you're deceased. In World War I, they were called burial case files. World War II in Korea, they're called IDPFs or individual deceased personnel files. Again, these exist for Vietnam, but we can't get access to them. And that's what's held in the National Archives, and that's what we're asking for and working to get. But there's lots of other things we can get. One is when we know who our person is, where they served, and when they died, we can usually figure out what was going on around them, what unit they're with, where they were stationed, what battle or campaign they're involved in. Another source is oral histories. They didn't survive, but many of the people around them did. And we'll talk a little bit about how to find those. Newspapers and other local history sources absolutely pull things in. Another source that will help some of you is the DPAA, the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency, which we'll talk a little bit about that too, particularly for those of you who are studying those from Korea or Vietnam who are missing in action. If you have a World War II service member missing in action, there's some files, but the files get much better as we move forward. And the last is military history sources. So the Army Center for Military History, Naval History and Heritage Command, Marine Corps History or Marine Corps University, and the Air Force Historical Support. A lot of this information is out there. And our goal is to find as many of the puzzle pieces, put them together, and admit where we have gaps. So we know that we have some restrictions here. We're waiting for the National Archives and we're doing our best. I process everything every day, but they're a little behind, and that's just the reality. So we're going to keep going, but what's restricted to us is the top 2 rows, not the bottom 5. So we're going to start our research here and then move on to the files as they come. All right, so let's talk about what these are. Personnel files. Here's one of John Doley Rucker's page of his OMPF, and it gives lots of good details. I have to be honest about the OMPFs. They seem simple, but there can be a lot of really good detail in them. They can range from anywhere from about 25 pages long to, I think our record is over 350 pages. So they range dramatically in what's there. And what I thought I would do here for our second question tonight, I've pulled literally just half a page from Rucker's file. So this is his second enlistment when he goes back into the Marine Corps starting in 1948. Love for you to take a look at this. Let's start with going into the Q&A box and tell me some things that you notice. What can you observe about his time in the Marine Corps in the second go round? So we're just starting with observations, and then we'll get to questions in a minute.
All right. He had a wide variety of duties, lots of jobs.
He jumps around, right? What are some of these jobs? What is he doing in this time period?
Plumbing,
Mm-hmm.
storeroom, driver, seems to be involved in transport.
Yeah, if we
Went
look
from
at these,
background. Oh, sorry.
he doesn't last too long in any of these jobs. It's not like he's a trucker for 2 years. So that's an interesting clue. Okay, what other things do we observe?
Went from background jobs to infantry.
Mm-hmm. So more of a
Clerk.
support role to an active role at the very end.
Most are not combat related.
Mm-hmm. And you can
Clerking,
imagine
water.
if you've got this guy who was a prisoner of war for 4 years, you might not want to be putting him out frontline infantry. You might be trying him out to drive a truck or stock a storeroom first.
Water supply chief. Someone's asking what was his age at the time.
What was it? He was born in 1915, and this is 1948.
Shows the dates he was in each job as well as his proficiency scores.
Yeah, how
Uh,
are those proficiency scores?
6, 7, as the kids would say.
6, 7, he gets an A, except for one, which is when he's in the infantry, where the only time he gets a 9. So that's kind of interesting and telling too. He's not the superstar Marine, right? He's kind of okay at what's going on. So again, these are different pieces. What questions might we ask based on just this half page of a record?
Someone is asking if the proficiency is out of 10.
I believe it is. I've only ever
Okay.
seen them out of 10, quite frankly. So, and I mean, that's what we can
That's
assume
all I've
here.
seen too, yeah. Question, is this typical of other Marines' experiences?
That's a good question. How does this compare to other people in the same time frame?
I wonder what travel means.
You're going somewhere,
Yeah,
and it could be,
there a couple of
short,
times.
just a day or two. Sometimes it can be longer. So, are we talking air travel, train travel, boat travel? In, 1949, 1950, it could be a combination of all of that.
Was he re-experiencing traumas?
Very possible.
How did his proficiency change from his time to his previous service years?
Ah, we'd have to compare that and look at those earlier records that are part of that file. So that'd be an interesting thing. Is he doing better? Is he doing worse?
What is AOL? Where does this take place?
Ah, that's a good question. Away on leave. That's not away without leave, that's away on leave. So he was off.
Maybe why was he moved around?
Yeah, what's going on here? One of the things you're going to see is that when you get these files, figure out what the most interesting pages are and really work them. Because sometimes what looks like a pretty simple page, like this is where he was assigned, really does drive some more questions. And again, sometimes we can answer them, sometimes we can't. Now, the next question, why don't we have these for everybody? And this is like my historian heart breaks because of this. In 1973, there was a massive fire at the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis. Yes, you used to be able to smoke in the building, among other things. The fire starts really, really late at night. It starts literally in the letter H. This fire burns for 4 days. It takes 4 full days for the firefighting teams to get it out. In the end, oh man, the building. The picture on the left is the roof of the building. It shows the damage and the buckling. And the picture on the right shows some of the smoke and water damage. So the fire was contained to a couple of floors, but the floors below it suffered an amazing amount of damage. Sometimes you will get files that are partially burned, that have either the singe marks on the end or the dark marks around the edges, or sometimes you get somewhere we have half the page because the page burned. And that's just what we have. This is really, really tough. We know that between 75 and 80% of the Army and Army Air Force records from World War I, World War II, and Korea are lost. And if you get a note from me that says your file is lost, I don't want you to feel bad about that. You're in the majority. This, pains my historian heart because when we find them, there's so many good details. And I can tell you that I have confirmed with the team in St. Louis that my grandfather's records from the U.S. Army Reserve during the Korean War era were lost in this fire. And so if we get these, they're a gift. If we don't, what other things might we get? And these are all things we've requested. So for those of you in section 1 in the World War I cohort, we have the burial case files. And we'll talk more about these in the next module, but these are the records that covered after you died. In a world where DNA analysis doesn't exist, they help us show how we tracked those who died, how we did temporary burials, and then moved them to permanent burials. Sometimes in the World War I case files, we get really lucky and get records of the World War I Gold Star Mother pilgrimages. This is something that only happened after World War I. where mothers or wives could have the opportunity to travel at government expense to go visit their loved one's grave over in Europe. And these are really unique. Sometimes you get tour itineraries, sometimes you get commentary. You almost always get the mother or wife's passport photo. And that's kind of a really interesting thing. Sometimes you get delayed, like I was supposed to go this year, I can't go, I want to go with my friend next year, or I'm too sick to go this year, and some really interesting correspondence that help give us a sense of the loss of the family afterwards. Okay, so once we get to World War II in Korea, we're not calling them burial files, we call them IDPFs, Individual Deceased Personnel Files. When we get these, I think, when they come, we'll share them as soon as they come. They're sad, but they're not graphic. I think it's important to know that they're not going to be violent, but they are going to have some sad stuff in them. At the same time, I think it really shows how hard the Army Graves Registration Service worked to identify these people, to make sure that they were keeping track of everyone. And we'll get more into this in the next one. But they had to be very, very careful because the DNA testing that we just take for granted simply didn't exist. And it's important to note that all of the IDPF files from World War II in Korea are Army files because no matter what branch of the service you were in, the Army took over once you were deceased. These files range. Honestly, if you're on a ship and lost at sea, when we get them, they tend to be about 5 or 6 pages long. This person was on the ship went down, there's not a whole lot else we can say. If there are cases later, I have seen ones over 300 pages long. It just kind of depends. To me, the most interesting ones are the ones that contain correspondence between the family members afterwards. Take your time, read through those. Really, those can create some fascinating stories and pieces to the story. For those who are missing in action, if they have not yet been identified, they all have active files with the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency, or the DPAA. I know it's acronymville. This is probably the single most moving place I've had the privilege to visit in my travels. There are 2 of them. One is at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. The one that I've had the chance to visit with Christopher is at Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam in Hawaii. And it really is a combination of both history and forensic science. And the amount of care that is put into these cases by the researchers, by the scientists, by the technicians is really second to none. And we probably talk about all this, but we'll save some of that for Q&A if you want to hear more. One thing that I will mention, we kind of stumbled across these by accident. There is a set of Vietnam POW MIA files that have been digitized in the Library of Congress. Now, I'm going to be honest with you, this is total hit or miss. But when there were investigators in the 1970s and the 1980s following up and looking into these cases, some of the files have been digitized. So if you are part of that group, go to loc.gov, set the search bar to manuscripts and mixed material, and search your person's name. You're either going to find a ton or nothing, and it might be nothing. But when we find these, oh my goodness, the level of detail and care that goes into them and the amount, you get a real sense of how hard people work to find these guys, even 10 or 20 or 30 years after the fact. Finally, don't skip those secondary sources. And don't think it's bad if that's all we have. We might only need to know what the 1st Marine Division was doing in a particular part of Vietnam in 1968. And we might have to rely on the newspapers or the secondary sources to get us there. So what I'm going to say, just like all the time, the big thing we want to do is learn as much as we can do. And the reason is we have to get past their death. That's one piece of the story, and there's so much more to the story, even in this very small module. What we want to do, assemble as much as we can. As of today, it's actually probably 9% because the one file I just got, 9% of what we have requested has arrived. So please be patient with us. And I promise as soon as we get it, you're going to get it. Give yourself time when you get that file to read, interpret, and ask questions. If we get it after January 9th, we'll go back and make fixes and edits and reviews. That's okay because that's what we do here. Third tip, don't skip the newspapers, particularly for those of you working in the Korea and Vietnam eras. Newspapers.com or local databases can be really, really helpful. Connect with families, see what they have or what they know of their military service. Looking for oral histories, check out the Veterans History Project. You can search by branch, you can search by time frame, you can search by unit. You might find somebody who was in the same campaign or the same battle telling their story. And that can give you as close as you can as to that eyewitness account. Research process is the same, but one little tip. Tell your researcher where in the file you got the information. So for your source, if you have an OMPF that's 200 pages long, say, hey, this information came from page 24. That helps us. Most of the time, if there's errors in a profile, it tends to come in this section, and this lets us fact check and make sure we've got everything right. Last step, if you need help, reach out. These files are full of abbreviations. Try to Google them. If you get stuck, reach out to us. One of our research mentors, for his Section 3 research mentor, Paul, was a 20-year veteran of the U.S. Coast Guard, and his specialty was personnel. So when I get stuck, I call Paul because he knows almost all of them. And if he gets stuck, we go to Ben Brands and the team at the ABMC. And my goodness, there's only ever been one that we haven't been able to figure out. So reach out and don't be afraid to do that. Okay, 801, that's not so bad. I'm going to go ahead and leave this up. You know the drill. Take your phone, scan it, knock out the survey, or if you're typing tinyurl.com/nhd-abmc-live. It's the same one we use every time, y'all, because, we keep it consistent. So we'd love to open up for questions. So questions about the military history, questions about the research, questions about ABMC. Heck, if you've got a random NHD question, I'll see if I can knock it out tonight. And then I'll tell you too, while we're waiting, our focus for next module is going to be what happens after you die. What are the stories and what are the processes after each of the wars? Because each of the four are dramatically different. And then from there, we're going to get into writing these profiles and starting to tell the stories and craft the stories. And that's when my job and Kate's job gets extra exciting because we get to really start reading the narratives.
I found the after part to be incredibly sad, kind of along the lines of what Lynn just described, but also really fascinating and how the handling of the deceased changes over time and why it does. Like it's also really, really interesting. And I've discovered in my classes, a lot of the military history buffs have never thought about what happens after people are killed in battle. So I think it's a really important part of the story that doesn't really get the attention that it deserves. So I'm really looking forward to the next module too.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, first question. Will the files be directly emailed to us or loaded into our Google Files linked in the Google Classroom or in our research organizer?
All right, so what we do is we put them in your folder. They're too big to email, most of them. We put them in your Silent Hero folder in the Military Life subfolder. Many of the files that come in are password protected. So I add a file into that same folder that says read first, that tells you the name of the person, and that has the password in it. So if you're scrambling, you're like, I don't remember the password, it's right in the folder. So double check that. When they get in, I email you to tell you they're there. I didn't get a chance to email the people that I put in tonight, but I'll do that first thing tomorrow. But it's there. Check it out. If you can't open it, let us know.
And that file also has your citation in it already done for you. So all you have to do is copy and paste it into your organizer.
They're really unique sources that aren't commonly cited, and you're not going to find on any kind of like Purdue Al Help Me website.
Yeah. I think this one is for Christopher. They're interested in what boot camp was like for soldiers going to Vietnam.
Um, sh- Shocking. So like a lot of people talk about how jarring that experience is, and I think a lot of that has to do with not just what you're being asked to do, which is a lot of acclimation to like the belly crawl and how to break down and clean the weapon. But the thing that most people seem to find really jarring is that transition from comfortable civilian life to the military and like having your head shaved, being put on this incredibly regimented schedule, being yelled at constantly. Drill instructors are, famous for getting in the face of people, and there's this, I think, like massive culture shock that a lot of the soldiers that I've read reflecting on it say like it was just so different than the civilian world. And then you're being trained, if you're in the combat uh, branches, you're being trained to go into dangerous places and often to kill people. And so like every part of it is really dissonant from your experience up to that point. And people, that a lot of the Vietnam era draftees are even younger. The draft age has been lowered. So you're getting, 19-year-olds who might have recently been in high school or, been working in a supermarket and are suddenly in this radically different environment. And then they're being told you are headed off to Vietnam, which is going to be terrifying and dangerous. And so I mean, I think of myself at 19 and how dramatically unprepared I would have been for that transition.
There is a follow-up to that. They're
Okay.
wondering if there was any swim instruction because their silent hero drowned.
So I would have to check and I would have to check. Send me an email. Um, One of the things that comes out in kind of my survey of this is that a lot of the people who are kind of pushed through the system are not as physically fit as they want to be, are not as physically strong as they want to be. Don't like some can swim, some have uh, low swimming ability. The military is about really lifting everybody up to an acceptable baseline rather than trying to make sure, especially in this period, rather than trying to make sure that everybody is a 10 on every score. So I I would have to check, but if you reach out, send me an email, and we'll try to figure out when your person was going through the process and what it was like at that camp at that moment.
If you don't have Christopher's email, send it to one of us. We'll hook
Yeah,
you,
yeah. I
get you
mean, it's
connected.
chamnergmu.edu. Um, I mean, one of the things that comes up in the 20th century about boot camp that the guys really dislike is one of the things you have to do is get just tons and tons of vaccinations, and you go through like a long process and multiple stops of being jabbed in the butt and jabbed in the arm. And guys just are like, oh, I don't like being a pincushion. Like, I don't like being reminded that the government now, claims my body as government property rather than a thing that belonged to me 2 days ago.
All right, next one. I have very little information about my hero. No birth certificate, no record of him in the census under his given name, no draft or enlistment card, but I have a social security number. Is there a way to use this to find information about him?
That's a hard one. I'm going to be honest with you. The military goes through a period where your social security number is also your service number, which is why we have them for some of, especially like the Vietnam era, some of the late Korean War era people. Um, it's really going to be more through names. I think what we have to do is see what we can tell from um, the military files or the FOIA files. I think we also need to then see what we can find through newspapers, figuring out where they were, where the family were, and if this person appears in local papers. Now, that may all come up flat. There's certain people, and I affectionately use the term that are ghosts, that we just don't have as much information on. And that's where we have to kind of take a different lens or a different approach. So, okay, we may not know a whole lot about them personally, but do we know the unit they were assigned to? Do they know the job? So they were part of an artillery um, unit. What was their job? What were artillery units doing in Vietnam? What was their role? What was the role of a messman second class? So just we have to take a different approach to tell as much as we can. But what I would say is if you're struggling, set up a time with your research mentor, talk through it with them, see what tips or suggestions they might have. And, if you get stuck, reach out to us. This is what we like to do. It's kind of fun.
And one of the other teachers had a suggestion for you as well,
Mhm.
that they found information from the town's records. They were able to email the person's town government, and that person directed them to the appropriate person to help look up their silent hero. So reach out
If you
to
can
local
find the
sources
armchair
too.
historians around this country, man, you find the right person at the right local government or the right VFW post, man, they can be a great help to you.
I've done that. BFW, chef's kiss. There's always somebody there who's ready to share. Next one. I received my files today. Thank you. And have been running through a lot of info all day. I am finding some interesting family information based on letters from his mother. Is that something I should explore further?
I think it depends what it is, but like anything, your research organizers are still open. So sometimes, especially in those OMPF files, you get information about education or hobbies or other things like that. If there's something here worth exploring, go for it. But just be careful it doesn't become a rabbit hole that takes away from the story. And again, if you're not sure which it is, shoot us an email. We'll weigh in.
Next up, I haven't been able to tell if my silent hero has great or grand nieces or nephews who might still be alive because he had siblings who were married. Not really a question, but that's an avenue to go down.
All right, here's the strategy. Look up the siblings and their spouses' names. I hate to say it, but look for obituaries.
Okay.
When you find obituaries, it tends to list children, spouses, grandchildren, and then you have other names. The other thing is if you can figure out what community they might be living in, um, Facebook neighborhood groups can be very helpful. Like, hey, I'm looking for the family of this person. I think they lived in this area. They might still live in this area. Does anybody have any connections? One of our teachers reached out to me about a week and a half ago. She was able to identify the church the family was involved in, reached out to the pastor in charge of the church. They put it out on a listserv, and family members were in contact with her in about 24 hours. So if you can figure out an organization or a connection, excuse me, and again, you might not get it. Know that only about 50% of our teachers, as hard as they work, are going to make the connection. And I can tell you, we can do really good profiles without files and without the connection. And we've done them. And if you get stuck or frustrated, reach out, set up a time. We're happy to help you.
That's it on my end.
All right. Well, it looks like we are hitting our limit tonight. I'm going to say a big thank you to Liz DeLucia and the team at the ABMC for making all of this exciting academic inquiry possible. And by a thank you to all of the teachers on our teams here who are working so hard to tell these very important stories. Know that we're here to help you. And by the time we get about 6 months out, you're all going to be published professional authors with the
So
work that you're doing. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your energy, and we appreciate and look forward to seeing the next round of research.
hope